Howdy BHRCers. You can find every episode of Why People on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever else you get your podcast content. On this episode number 22, we'll chat with Chris D'Arcy, the Chief Human Resources Officer at Arcadia. Chris has an awesome background and is a well-known HR executive in the tech space in New England, so stay tuned. All right, welcome BHRC members and our other audience to the Why People podcast. For those folks listening for the first time, Why People is a Boston HR Council podcast production. The BHRC is one of the largest HR and people executive communities in the world, with just over 1,500 council members. Would love to introduce co-founder of the Boston HR Council and co-host of Why People, Paul Roberts.
Hey, thank you, Sean. Good morning to our people. Thanks for joining us today for Why People. Super excited for today's guest and the second best golfer on the podcast.
Thanks, Paul. And without further ado, super excited to introduce Chris D'Arcy. Chris is the CHRO of Arcadia, super well known in New England for being a great HR leader, specifically in the technology space. But Chris, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Sean, Paul. It's always great to be with you and spend time with a fellow Boston HR Council members.
Awesome, Chris. Well, Chris, I know that you've chatted and you've listened to a few of these, so you know that we kind of follow the same conversation cadence, right? We kind of go past, present, future, but everyone's, so different. Their path is so different. It creates a really different conversation every time. So would love to kind of start off by asking you, bring us back, and you can go as far back as you want. Some people go all the way to the cradle. Some people go to back, school. What helped root us a little bit in Chris D'Arcy and kind of, your formative years.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Sean. So I grew up in Brockton, Mass, son of wonderful parents in the teaching and coaching profession as well as nursing. So I've been involved and been around folks who do things for the greater good and do things for others. So that's kind of where my DNA has come from. And after college, I went to at UMass Dartmouth. I worked for the state, specifically in Bristol County, and working what's called as a job developer in these distressed areas in Fall River and in New Bedford when these manufacturing companies are moving to the south or moving overseas. Companies like, bring you back, like Anderson Little, for example, the clothing manufacturer. All of that industry down in Fall River, New Bedford were leaving, and what you were left with were these great trained workers who needed to find a job. And my job was to find them opportunities either through training or connecting them with employers in Southeastern Massachusetts. And this is before the internet, right? So I'm writing letters to all the banks and employers and knocking on doors and getting a sense of being part of that community down in Fall River and New Bedford. And what I realized very quickly is that employment is so important to the family fabric, right? How important and prideful it is of being employed and having a job, having a career. And I really leaned into that as best I could. And those were in the early 90s, where it was where outsourcing really began in this country. And in the textile world and manufacturing, again, that had its complexities and challenges as well. But I really thrived at that and really enjoyed that. At the same time, I had friends who were in the financial sector working at Putnam, Fidelity Investments, John Hancock, Investors Bank and Trust, and some of these old companies as well. And I got an opportunity to interview at Fidelity to be a recruiter and to help them build out their investor centers around New England. And I thought this is the time to look at the private sector and get the best out of my abilities. And also socially, I wanted to, live in Boston and be with my friends and kind of have that, lifestyle as a mid 20-year-old and late 20-year-old. And I took the position and really loved and enjoyed the recruiting aspect of building teams. Doing it at Fidelity was the best place to do it as a young person in Boston. Back in the day, even today, Fidelity has really built some real superstars and created some superstars in the HR profession within New England, if not across the country. And so that experience at Fidelity really helped springboard me into my HR career today. So I was becoming more curious about, okay, hiring is great, be a good recruiter, but what happens when you hire this employee? What's next for them? And I was curious about their development, and I got really prideful when I saw the folks that I've hired get promoted, move on in their careers. So even leave Fidelity to go to a bigger job, and knowing that I had a real opportunity, and I was a real agent of change for them in their career, and I felt prideful for that. And then that's when I kind of spun from just recruiting to overall HR, and that's where I really found my sea legs, if you will, and moved on in financial services through over there to moved to MFS investment management, and then caught the technology bug back in the mid to late 90s, where the rest of us did during the dot-com boom, and had some real great runs at BBN Technologies, which was GTE, into networking, moved over to open market, worked for a great guy, Michael Messier, who I think is one of the the founders and really brought together the HR community within New England. Michael was a great mentor to me, learned a lot from him, and then moved on to a couple of startups, and here I am today at Arcadia and couldn't be more happier.
Awesome. Well, Chris, thanks for kind of giving us the foundation here for our conversation. I knew, we're friends, so I knew a lot of that. I didn't know all of it, though, so I'm going to ask you some questions, and love you giving a shout out to your parents as teachers and coaches. But the first question I have is, help us and help the audience understand, at what point did you actually know about the term human resources? Like, did you know when you were working as a job developer, right? Did you know that was HR? Did your parents know much about HR? Like help us understand a little bit about when you realized like HR was your thing.
Yeah, even back then, Sean, it was called personnel, right? It wasn't really, HR, I think, was becoming, that title of our industry, during those days. Interestingly enough, my Uncle Ray was the head of sales and later became the CEO of a company called Interactive Data out in Bedford, Massachusetts. Also, they had an office in Post Office Square. So he was, as I mentioned about leaving, the nonprofit world and being a job developer for the state of Massachusetts, my uncle really helped me see where my talent was going through. And that's when I heard HR and where my talents could be best applied in the private sector was through my Uncle Ray. About that's where kind of I think you could really maximize your talent is in the HR world. And back, as I said again, back in 92, 93, things were kind of really scaling in that world. That's where I really understood the term HR, because I came from the world of personnel and administrative functions back then.
That's interesting. Uncle Ray helped you out a little bit, understand the private side. So really cool that you're in this job developer role, doing some really, great things for folks that are in transition. You make the decision to kind of test it out in corporate America, land at Fidelity. Tell us a little bit about that change, right? Because even though I think what you were doing in that job developer role and what you were doing at Fidelity is similar, had to be some differences, of course. Like, tell us a little bit about that leap.
No, it was night and day. I used to work in a basement at Bristol Community College in this asbestos-ridden building in Fall River. Now I'm at back then, which was the Crown Jewel of Boston, which was the World Trade Center back in the late 90s, right? And I come from a scrappy job, digging it out of the dirt, knocking on doors, writing letters to be successful. Now there's rules, right? Now you're part of a team, right? And now it's in small things like wearing a suit every day, and back people remember those days, and understanding that I was part of something bigger, right? Part of a team and what we did together in terms of my bosses, and and I learned a lot from a guy named Bill Van Anglen at Fidelity, and Brian Johnson, who I think he since retired. He retired as the head of HR, but Brian was the director and VP of HR in the retail and customer service world of Fidelity. So I learned a lot from those two as well. But yeah, it was shocking night and day in terms of corporate culture, how to be a professional, and really kind of learning the ropes from where it came from and where I was working to where I was, 2 years later.
Well, it's really cool, Chris. So this is episode number 22, right? We've had some of your peers on, some really, really great people leading the function in New England, and it's neat. Obviously everyone gets their start somewhere, and it's typically in one part of the overall HR function, right? The spectrum that keeps getting wider, right? And we've had a few folks that, like yourself, have started off as recruiters. Tell us a little bit, and I know you're a modest guy, so you kind of went through this fast and kind of the the background. But tell us a little bit about how you started to kind of climb the ranks, if you will, as a recruiter, and like what skills you had to kind of develop to take, the next role that was more than just an individual recruiting role. Like, tell us a little bit about that journey.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think, and folks in my generation know when a lot of the financial services companies in Boston started to move to the suburbs, right? Moving to Marlborough, moving to Burlington, when they started to move out of the city into the suburbs back in, 95, 6, and 7, Fidelity decided that Merrimack, New Hampshire would be their site for all of like retail services, customer service, investor relations, all those. And they actually leased out the old deck buildings right up in Marlborough in southern New Hampshire. And the head of staffing tasked me with heading up the recruiting team to really, quote unquote, fill up half the building with new staff. And that's when I realized I took that step, Sean, to now I'm working for, a senior person in terms of the business, right? Also, how do I assemble a team of recruiters and also do it where now my peer group, now I'm their manager all of a sudden, right? And learning those skill sets to have a good rapport, get good production out of the team. But most importantly, what I learned, Sean, was building tremendous relationships with my business partners. So I understood, where the leaders of the investor world was in terms of the premium service, the customer service side, the investor side, and getting to know them personally, what they needed out of talent, right? Because it's ever changing of what they need. Is it problem solving skills? Is it de-escalating issues? Like, what are we looking at here? And so we're always changing the profile of who we're looking for. And I was always in their office again of, our COO of that business was there, right? The SVP of retail services was in the building. So I made sure I was with them as much as possible to learn from them. What did they need to be very successful on the business side? And that's where I started to learn about, and even today, where it's really about human capital management rather than kind of people operations or HR. If we think more about human capital management in that business sense, that's where we drive real efficiency. We drive credibility and outcomes where you can really see the business outcome predicated and the results driven from great practice, just not in recruiting, but in overall people management.
No, I appreciate you kind of, bringing us through that journey and landing on kind of that human capital management piece, right? The overarching element of the work that you and your peers do relative to the full business. So another note I had here and a question, Chris, is, and, for the audience, we were chatting a little bit on our pre-call, just about, business in general. But Chris, so you make the transition, Fidelity, MFS, you make the transition from the financial world into the tech world. Tell us a little bit about that transition. I know some of it had to do with timing and kind of what all the rage was at that point in time. But help us understand a little bit about how you got, I guess, hip to those businesses to ensure that you were able to be a great leader. Like, how'd you learn the business coming out of finance and into tech? Like, help us out understand how a little bit.
Well, being curious, in the financial services sector, knowing where technology was going. And even today, Fidelity was the first company in financial services that really spent and invested in technology. I mean, the stories are legendary of what they've done around technology, right? And just not around managing funds, but managing people, right? Bringing new applications, bringing new systems, right? They were the first company, I think, in the country to invest close to $1 billion, right, in their in Fidelity's technology center around security, compliance, making it more efficient to communicate and resolve problems with customers. And I just saw where that was going, and then looking at the world, right, and looking at where the internet came, and where all of this was headed towards around information and technology, how it was really being adopted to business practices. And also, this is where the term the war on talent started with back in the late 90s, where everybody, developers and product managers were racing to, the internet, for example, or technology-driven companies where it wasn't a SaaS enterprise companies during those days, but it was headed towards that. And so I knew where scale was and where growth was. It wasn't going to be in the traditional Boston-based financial services companies. It was going to be either around the country, coming out of Cambridge, coming out of where now venture capital became a buzzy term, for example, right? Private equity became a buzzy term, and investing in great ideas, right? And just not great institutions, but great companies started with great leaders and great ideas where they were funded by really smart investors. And that's where things started to turn. And that's where, again, when you start a company, a seed round through Series D, people and talent play a major role in that. And that's where I really understood, that's where the future was headed towards. And I wanted to be a big part of that.
Exciting, Chris, and I know we talk family a lot and kids. It must be a kind of a cool flex to tell your kids that you were slaying business around back when the internet was invented. Do you ever flex that?
I flex it too much. It's interesting, talking about Hotmail, and Hot Jobs and all those things through Yahoo and NetSuite and all the Netscape, right? And where there was no video, right? There wasn't any content. Content was, the written word or articles, and just, tell them how things were in the olden days. It bores them, but it also, it gives them kind of a real window into what Dad did, prior to them being on this earth.
Well, Chris, before we kind of jump into kind of the present time, last question I had relative to kind of your background, your foundation, can you tell us a little bit? I love you telling us about the project that you kind of tasked with at Fidelity, right? That kind of elevated you into a manager role and helping fill, some of these sites, when those changes were going on. Can you tell us a little bit from that point to your first, director or VP or CHRO role? Can you tell us a little bit about what that journey looked like as far as, positions you had to take or competencies that you had to kind of fill to be able to lead a full team across the HR spectrum?
Right. Yeah. When I was at BBN Technologies, and then moving on from there, what I had to learn was employee relations, organizational design, and compensation and benefits, for example. The whole, as I talked about, that whole pie wheel of what in my slice was a big slice, which was recruiting, right? So all of us in this industry and folks listening can probably agree with me. There is one anchor that you lean on. For me, as we said earlier, it was recruiting and talent acquisition. But I had to learn the other facets that to make me a full, well-rounded HR professional. And I did that by getting opportunities to learn, working with employment lawyers at different firms, understanding the legalities in employment law around treating employees, right, from the first day to their last day. Working with really senior HR folks around proper ways to apply employee relations tactics and solutions to problems, right? And learning very quickly, to me, Sean and Paul, I learned quickly then that HR is not black and white. Now, recruiting is black and white, right? It's red light, green light, half the time. But working in the gray was a little bit different, right? Because you had to really make smart decisions of what's best for the company. That's your number one kind of tenet of what you do, is really protect the interests of the company, but also manage employees with respect, empathy, and making sure they're treated fairly as well. So that balance of making sure that the company is protected, the employees have a great place in creating a destination workplace, pay them fairly, treat them fairly, give them opportunities to grow. That is you do that by just doing the work, right? It's not out of a book. It's not a certificate. It's actually doing it and having really good examples in the real world time of working in the gray and making really smart decisions. And I was able to do that because I worked for some great companies. I worked with some great CEOs. I mean, let's talk about Silverlink. Silverlink was a tremendous company in the healthcare technology world, primarily in the population health space, really helping, patients and so forth, and member services from other insurance companies make really good health decisions, right? And my CEO at the time, Stan Novak, and I met Stan when I was at BBN Technologies, or GTE into networking, and Stan really brought me into the world of venture capital and growth and scale and the importance of talent, developing talent. And we heard a great line from the new GM of the New England Patriots recently about you got to invest in your core first. Before going outside for talent, you got to invest in your core and develop your core. And I think I learned a lot of that from Stan. I learned a lot from Stan, by the way. And those lessons from him carry me to today. And I think young HR professionals should understand that you have to make mistakes. You have to bruise your elbow. You have to skin your knee to learn. And that's okay. Making a mistake is okay. A a former CEO of mine at a company called Liaison International, Michael Berenger, said to me, make a better mistake, right? And I think that in today's world, maybe making a mistake, may think that you put your job on the line or you put yourself in, jeopardy. But in real good learning environment, learning companies, making mistakes and getting better is the way to learn. And that's how I did it.
Yeah, I love that. Geez, a couple of great quotes there, Chris. Unfortunately, most of them are from your former bosses. The Chris D'Arcy meme from Why People is going to be like the Michael Scott. You miss 100% of the shots that you don't take. Wayne Gretzky, hype, on The Office. So
yeah.
No, I'm full with you. But yeah, thanks for kind of bringing us to the current time, right? So that kind of path of skinning your knees, bruising your elbows, starting to learn all these different functions to round out your total competency as an HR leader. So real time, all right, and we don't necessarily need to talk a ton about Arcadia and where you're at right now, but I'm just curious, Chris, where we are here in 2024, can you tell us a little bit about how you think about the CHRO role and how it's changed, how it's evolved, and how you're thinking about it has changed at all?
It's much different than what it was, I'll say, Sean and Paul, maybe 10 years ago, right? A couple of CHROs I worked for in the past, they really were smart on strategy and setting the tone and setting, the tone and culture of what the HR team was about, how we attack problems, almost like a CEO kind of world or a coach. I think in this world today, post-COVID, the CHROs have got to get their fingernails dirty. They have to work side by side with their staff. They have to be a working manager and doing things that they've done 20 years ago, and that's okay. Doing recruiting, managing a benefit orientation, for example, things that where HR managers would manage. I feel to get to know my people as best as I can, I want to do the work, right? And I think in this day and age, CHROs have got to understand that yes, it's important to be in the room with the other colleagues. Yes, it's important to be in the board meetings, understanding M&A as well, understanding those types of high level discussions, but you have to roll up your sleeves. You have to get doing the work with your team, and the managers and directors have got to see that you care about their teams, right? You care about redoing or revising performance management exercises. You got to think differently about compensation strategies around incentive comp. You got to think differently about it being on top of employment law in these days, right? Around things like non-competes and non-solicits and things that make a barrier to employment something that becomes an issue, and working with your general counsel to make sure that we're trying to provide, as I said earlier, and I think also we have to do too, Sean, is build a destination workplace, whether it's remote, hybrid, or in person. It's our job to be really, I think culture-wise, that we're the straw that stirs the drink here. And we got to embrace that and celebrate that. It's not marketing, it's not sales. Culture is driven by the head of HR. And I take great pride in that, always have been. So I think that's where our, the title of CPO or CHRO in these days, post 24, 25, 26 is changing. And our leadership has got to understand what our companies are looking for, and most importantly, what we have to do to show our importance and our vigor in our firms.
That's well stated, Chris. And I'm just going to go back to kind of stay in this area. I'm going to go back to something that you said at the beginning of the conversation. Is this, and we've heard it from a lot of your peers, stated a couple of different ways. But CHROs and really HR professionals in general, but specifically CHROs, because of leading the function, operate in this unique space that sits between the business and the people, right? And folks have said, hey, it's really the only place within the organization that exists, right? As far as managing the business and managing the people. We've heard some people say a lot of ways it's almost like a chief of staff, in the sense that the CHRO has the direct line of sight to the people of the business, to kind of the pulse of the people, and also a direct line of sight to the C-suite or the executive leadership team, and having to keep all of those leaders apprised of kind of how folks are feeling or how people are kind of viewing the business. Can you tell us a little bit? Can you go a little bit deeper on that role of the CHRO between the people and the business?
I'm a big Godfather fan, Sean. And so I look at my role as Tom Hagen, right? And so I want to be the counsel, the voice to my CEO. And right now, Michael Musi is the CEO who I'm working with and hopefully for a long time at Arcadia. Michael is a dynamic, really powerful thought leader. He's a tremendous person and a great leader of people. Like I mentioned with Stan Novak back at Silverlink in 2009 through 13. And Michael and I have a really, really strong relationship where I'm in his ear all the time about what's happening on the floor, quote unquote, right? What's happening, getting ahead of employee issues before they become an issue, for example. Being very proactive with him, bringing up ideas of how we can get better, how we can improve our company, how we get more speed to the company, how we empower people to make decisions, raise their hand, and offer solutions without waiting for the manager's manager to give them the green light. And creating that space of curiosity and inquisitiveness and energy, and that's where I think the CHR role should be today. And I think my relationship with Michael is a clear example of that.
Yeah, that's kind of lines up, Chris, with what a lot of your peers have said, right? That confidant into the executive leadership team or the CEO to give line of sight to kind of really the culture or maybe what's coming up, what challenges are coming up relative to the people in the culture. Well, Chris, really good to understand kind of what's going on now. We always spend the last 10 minutes or so of this conversation kind of thinking about the future, right? So we'll ask you a few questions relative to the future. I guess first, tell us a little bit about how you're thinking about your role, the CHRO role in general, as it relates to what it's going to look like in 5 years from now and how you're planning for that.
Yeah, a lot of it right now is through AI, right? How can we apply AI to our practices, be it recruiting, talent acquisition, how do we apply emerging technology to make the HR people operations function again, more efficient, driving down, being more lean. I think companies are going to learn more by not just AI, but other emerging technologies that you can become a leaner company and still be really strong and drive revenue as best you can. And I think the best companies will embrace that and understand how they look and organize their business around these emerging technologies. I think that's really important where you can't stay flat. You can't stay flat-footed. And I think the organizational design of what HR looks like today, from comp and benefits and talent acquisition and your generalists and business partners, that's going to change very quickly. Where, as I said earlier, most professionals in this function these next 10, 20 years have to be not great, but good at everything. Even though you're the director of talent acquisition, you have to understand ER, understand how we're applying comp and benefit strategies, for example. I think that's where our profession is headed as well as we digest and apply these great technologies as well.
Yeah, I mean, that seems to be the common kind of thought process, Chris, is this next wave of technology relative to AI. How's it going to change the function? How's it going to make things leaner? But how's it going to empower people to be able to do more meaningful work, be more connected work to the people, and maybe take away some of the administrative burden, take away some of the manual burden around that. So as we say, stay tuned, because we're in this somewhat weird holding pattern of theoretical use cases versus who's putting it into practice. So
cool.
Excited to kind of see what that looks like. So last question here, Chris. I've had a blast kind of catching up, and as someone that knows you pretty well, even a lot of stuff here I didn't know. And we ask this question of everyone, but put yourself in the shoes of either somebody graduating from college, somebody graduating from high school, somebody looking to make a career change that is considering an entry-level HR role, and they I listen to this podcast and they say, wow, that Chris D'Arcy guy, aside from the fact that he invented the internet, he seems like a really cool guy. Tell us a little bit about advice you would give to folks that are kind of thinking about getting into this world, at the entry level.
I think, in today's world of what I'm hearing, and I'm connected to a lot of the alumni, some of the groups at UMass Dartmouth, is that a lot of folks are thinking about either social work, for example, or HR, meaning it's a problem-solving people industry. But I want to remind them that, yes, there's tenets of that, but most importantly, where HR and people operations and human capital management are today, it's much more business driven, right? And you got to show value in the return on investment. When you invest in G&A functions, like finance and HR, you really have to show the ability to help drive business and understand business, for example. So taking that great, maybe the DNA that new grads have about, again, social work in HR and solving problems and working for people in that service-minded industry, that's super important to have that as your base. But you have to be a curious cat and be inquisitive to understand where HR is in certain companies and where it's managed and driven. So my advice is that get any position within HR, be it talent, be it a recruiting assistant, a generalist assistant or HR assistant. Get your foot in the door in these days and get in there and learn and be open and be curious. Don't go in there with an agenda saying, I want to be the head of HR in 10 years or I want to be the head of talent acquisition in 10 years. Be the best HR professional you can be. And wherever you go, your talent, your experience, and your success will drive your career path.
I like that, Chris. That was an original Chris D'Arcy meme. That's great advice. Well, Chris, have really appreciated our time today. You've been a great friend, a great Boston HR Council member for a long time, and really excited that we could spend some time on the podcast today.
Thank you, Sean. Paul, thank you. Thank you for what you do for our industry. As I said earlier before we started recording, the Boston HR Council is a very important institution within New England. As we've gone to hybrid and remote work, we rarely have these industry-driven times together. And what you do for us, how you celebrate our function, how you bring thought leaders together and really shine a light on what we do, I can't thank you enough.
Well, we appreciate that, Chris, and thanks for saying it. We looking forward to seeing you soon.
You will.